300 bishops walked into a room in the year 325, and by the time they walked out, the entire blueprint of human salvation had been rewritten. But what was voted out of that room was not just theology. It was the direct path between your soul and the true source, stripped away line by line, gospel by gospel, until all that remained was a system perfectly designed to keep you blind, obedient, and endlessly recycled. Imagine the city of Nicaea in the year 325 Anno Domini. The air smells of burning cedar and imperial ambition. Roman soldiers line the marble corridors. Servants carry wine and bread to men who have traveled from the farthest corners of the known world. From Egypt, from Syria, from Persia, from the cold edges of Britannia. These men are bishops, leaders of Christian communities. Some of them bear scars on their bodies from the persecutions of earlier decades. Some of them walked through fire to keep their faith alive. And yet not one of them arrived here on their own terms. Every single one of them was summoned. Summoned by an emperor. Summoned by Constantine. A man who had spent the better part of his life worshiping the sun god Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and who had only recently turned his political gaze toward the rapidly growing movement of Christianity. Constantine did not come to this council as a humble servant of the faith. He arrived draped in purple and gold, surrounded by armed guards, seated on a throne that towered above every bishop in the room. He was not a theologian. He was a conqueror, and conquerors do not call councils to discover truth. They call councils to manufacture it. For 3 centuries before that moment, Christianity had not been one thing. It had been a living, breathing, fractured, and deeply alive constellation of beliefs, communities, texts, and spiritual paths. In the deserts of Egypt, communities of seekers gathered around texts that described the soul as a divine spark imprisoned in matter, longing to return to the true source beyond the false creator. In Alexandria, teachers spoke of a cosmos layered with invisible rulers, beings of immense power who governed the material world and who fed on human ignorance. In Syria, scrolls circulated that recorded the secret sayings of Jesus, teachings that spoke not of sin and punishment, but of inner awakening, of the kingdom of heaven as something already present within each human being. These were not fringe ideas whispered in dark corners. These were the living heart of early Christian spirituality for hundreds of thousands of people across the ancient world. But they shared one dangerous quality. They made priests unnecessary. They made emperors irrelevant. They pointed every soul directly inward, toward a divine source that no institution could control, no emperor could tax, and no army could threaten. And that is precisely why they had to be destroyed. The official story of the Council of Nicaea is that it was called to resolve a theological dispute about the nature of Christ, specifically whether Jesus was of the same substance as God the Father or of similar but distinct substance. This dispute, known as the Arian controversy, had been fracturing Christian communities across the empire. Constantine needed unity. A fractured religion was a useless political tool. So he called the bishops together, hosted them at imperial expense, and made it abundantly clear which conclusion he expected them to reach. The result was the Nicene Creed, a carefully worded doctrinal statement that every bishop was expected to sign. Those who refused were exiled. The message was simple and brutal. Agree with the empire or disappear. But the Nicene Creed was only the visible surface of what happened in that room. Beneath the doctrinal debates, a far more significant process was already underway. The process of deciding which texts, which gospels, which teachings would survive, and which would be erased from the record of human spiritual history forever. The texts that describe the demiurge, the false creator god who built the material prison, were targeted. The gospels that spoke of the archons, the invisible rulers who governed the cycles of reincarnation and kept souls bound to the wheel of matter, were condemned. The writings that gave Mary Magdalene her true voice as a spiritual equal to the male disciples were suppressed. The teachings of Valentinus, of Basilides, of Marcion, Gnostic teachers who had attracted enormous followings across the Roman world, were branded as heresy, and their communities were marked for persecution. What was being voted out of existence was not simply a set of alternative opinions about theology. What was being destroyed was an entire spiritual technology, a technology that the Gnostics had preserved and transmitted for generations, a technology built on one central, radical, and deeply threatening insight that every human soul carries within it a fragment of divine light that belongs not to this world, not to its rulers, not to its systems, but to a realm of pure consciousness so far beyond the material prison that no emperor, no bishop, and no false creator god could ever touch it. The Gnostics called this the divine spark. They called the path to its remembrance gnosis, direct inner knowing. And they taught that this knowing was available to every soul, without intermediary, without institution, without the permission of any authority on earth. This is what Constantine could not allow, because a population of people who know their own divine nature does not need emperors. It does not need armies. It does not need elaborate hierarchies of priests and bishops standing between the soul and the sacred. The Gnostic path was not just a spiritual alternative. It was a political threat of the highest order. And so the machinery of the newly empowered church was turned against it with a ferocity that should shock every person alive today who has ever been told that Christianity is a religion of love. The philosopher and Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon had already been laying the groundwork for this persecution for well over a century before Nicaea. His massive work against heresies, written in the late 2nd century Anno Domini, was essentially a manual for identifying and destroying Gnostic communities. Irenaeus understood something that Constantine would later weaponize. He understood that the greatest threat to institutional religious power is not atheism. Atheism can be dismissed. The greatest threat is a living, direct, interior spiritual experience that makes institutions irrelevant. Against that kind of knowing, no argument is sufficient. The only response is force. And force is what came. In the decades following Nicaea, imperial edicts were issued ordering the seizure and destruction of Gnostic texts. Libraries were burned. Communities were scattered. Teachers were imprisoned or killed. The rich and diverse spiritual landscape of early Christianity, which had included women leaders, communal ownership, direct mystical experience, and a cosmology that named the rulers of this world as the real enemy of the human soul, was systematically dismantled and replaced with a vertical hierarchy of authority that flowed from God to emperor, to pope to bishop, to priest to layperson, with the layperson having no direct access to the sacred whatsoever. Think about what this means for a moment. For hundreds of years before Nicaea, there were Christians, sincere, devoted, spiritually serious people who read texts describing the material world as a prison constructed by a false god, who practiced forms of meditation and inner contemplation designed to awaken the divine spark within, who passed down secret teachings about how to navigate the afterlife without being captured and recycled by the archons, who understood karma and not as divine justice, but as a mechanism of entrapment, who saw the tunnel of light not as a gateway to heaven, but as a luminous snare. All of that knowledge that had been carefully preserved and transmitted across generations at enormous personal cost, was voted out of existence in a room in Nicaea by men who were guests of a sun-worshipping emperor with a political agenda. And the texts that survived, the ones that were declared canonical, the ones that were copied and distributed across the empire with imperial backing, were selected not for their spiritual depth or their fidelity to the original teachings of Jesus, but for their usefulness to a system of control. The Jesus of the canonical Gospels still contains fragments of the deeper teaching. The kingdom of heaven within you, the light of the world, the living water. But the architecture that was built around those fragments, the doctrine of original sin, the necessity of priestly mediation, the threat of eternal punishment, the promise of reward for obedience, that architecture was not spiritual. It was political. It was designed to produce compliant subjects, not awakened souls. The texts that were destroyed or hidden did not disappear completely. Some of them survived in fragments. Some were hidden by communities who understood what was being lost. And then in 1945, in the desert cliffs near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer broke open a sealed clay jar and found something that the Council of Nicaea had failed to destroy. The Gnostic Gospels, the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the hypostasis of the archons, texts that had been buried in the Egyptian desert for over 1,600 years, waiting for a moment in human history when enough souls had awakened enough to receive what they contained. Reading these texts today, the sensation is extraordinary, not because they are exotic or alien, but because they feel familiar. Because something in the deepest part of the self recognizes what they are describing. The soul trapped in matter. The false rulers of this world. The divine spark that no prison can extinguish. The path of inner knowing that bypasses every external authority and connects directly to the source. These are not ancient curiosities. They are maps. Maps drawn by people who knew exactly what had been done to the human soul and who refused to let that knowledge die. What was voted out of existence in Nicaea was not a set of beliefs. It was a living tradition of inner freedom, a tradition that said the divine is not above you, not outside you, not accessible only through the permission of the powerful. The divine is within you, has always been within you, cannot be taken from you, can only be forgotten. And forgetting, deliberate, manufactured, institutionally enforced forgetting, is exactly what Nicaea was designed to produce. There is something else that almost no one discusses when they talk about Nicaea. Something that sits just beneath the surface of the official history and radiates a cold and clarifying light when you finally see it. Constantine himself was never baptized as a Christian until he was lying on his deathbed. For the entirety of his reign, the reign during which he weaponized Christianity and used the Council of Nicaea to reshape it into an instrument of imperial control, he remained technically outside the faith he was engineering. He continued to appear on coins bearing the image of Sol Invictus. He continued to use the symbols of the sun cult alongside the newly adopted Christian symbols. He was not a convert. He was a strategist. And the strategy was breathtaking in its audacity. Take the most rapidly growing spiritual movement in the empire. Hollow it out. Fill it with doctrine that produces obedience. destroy the teachings that produce inner freedom, then wrap the whole structure in the language of salvation and distribute it with the full force of imperial authority. It was not the first time a living spiritual tradition had been captured and weaponized by power, but it may have been the most consequential. The question that remains, the question that every soul who encounters this knowledge must eventually face, is not a historical question. It is not about bishops and emperors and ancient councils. It is about right now. It is about what you have been told your whole life about who you are, where you came from, and what you are worth without the permission of some external authority. Because the Council of Nicaea is not over. It continues every time a soul is told that it is broken, insufficient, in need of correction, in need of mediation, in need of an institution's blessing before it can approach the sacred. The vote to erase the divine spark from human self-understanding has been renewed in every generation since 325. The tools have changed. The councils have different names. The emperors wear different clothes. But the mechanism is identical. Manufacture consent, control the narrative, and above all, keep the soul convinced that it is too broken, too small, and too unworthy to access the sacred without permission. That is the real legacy of Nicaea. Not a creed, not a doctrine, a template for spiritual imprisonment that has been copied and refined for 17 centuries and counting. And it will continue to be renewed until enough souls remember what was taken from them and refuse, finally and completely, to forget again. The bishops left Nicaea carrying signed creeds and imperial protection. The Gnostics left history carrying something far more durable, a truth buried in desert sand, sealed in clay, waiting 1,600 years for the world to be ready. They burned the scrolls. They exiled the teachers. They rewrote the story from the ground up. And still the spark survived, because some things cannot be voted out of existence. Some things live in the part of you that was never born into this world and will never be recycled back into it. The part that is always known. The part that is knowing right now, even as these words reach you across the silence. If something in this video stirred a recognition you cannot quite name, that quiet, persistent sense that the story you were handed was never the whole story, then you're already further along the path than most will ever travel. Subscribe to Gnostic Inner Eye and join a growing community of souls who are done forgetting. Every week we go deeper into the hidden architecture of reality, the suppressed teachings of the ancient world, and the inner technologies that were buried so you would never find them. The knowledge they tried to erase is still here. And so are you. That is not an accident.